Chapter 12, Lecture 3, so the last one in Chapter 12, is going to start out with a good old case study with polar bears. Unfortunately, polar bears up in the Arctic Circle are getting hit by global warming. The environmental impact, of course, on polar bears, they're getting hit by PCBs and DDT and what's known as a circle of poison. The wind is picking up and bringing all that chemical all the way from the middle latitudes all the way down to the equatorial latitudes up there and affecting them. Plus, global warming is actually reducing the amount of ice. And what they do to hunt for things like seal is they go from ice sheet to ice sheet to ice sheet. And if there's no ice there, obviously, they can't get their food. And of course, they're either starving for that matter. International treaties that help protect species. First one, 1975, was the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, known as the CITES Treaty. That was signed by up to 172 countries. It banned the selling, hunting, or capturing or threatening or endangered species and transporting them across international borders. So what that really means is, technically, if something's endangered or threatened, you are not supposed to buy it from another nation or receive it, even if you buy it in a store around here, if it's deemed endangered or threatened. That does get protected. The problem with this law is it's really hard to control other countries. The Convention on Biological Diversity, known as the BCD, focuses on ecosystems, and it really aims to reverse the decline of biological diversity. 190 countries actually signed this. Unfortunately, George Bush pulled us out of this, and it's really, again, to keep ecosystems intact, to preserve biodiversity. A member of that. Lacey Act of 1900, established way 100 and some years ago, is United States particularly where we can't transport live or dead animals or their parts across state lines without a permit if they are deemed endangered or threatened, especially. So you cannot go to Texas, pick up something that's threatened, and bring it back to Wisconsin. That is against policy. Of course, the biggie is the U.S. Endangered Species Act of 1973. We later had amendments to make it even stronger in 82, 83, and 85. And the idea behind this was to identify and protect endangered species in U.S. and abroad, and of course protect the land on. Who identifies all this? Well, in the oceans, it's the National Marine Fisheries Service. In everything else, terrestrial freshwater systems, it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or the USFS, that endangered and threatened species, and then lists them on the red list, IUCN red list. We have these things called hotspots. You can see the picture of the hotspots in the United States. Those are areas that are deemed fragile, and they have a lot of biodiversity. They also have increasing tourism or populations, and these areas, again, are deemed fragile, that we may lose species in here. There's an idea called Habitat Conservation Plan, or HCP colonies, and they're really designed to reach a compromise between private landowners and protecting the land that has endangered, threatened species. So maybe give them some tax breaks, or maybe just out of the goodness of their heart protect their land so it doesn't get disrupted. It does allow destruction of some critical habitats or the killing of population if the developer protects critical nesting sites, sets aside habitat, and maintains travel corridors for, again, threatened or endangered species. The problem is it's not approved by scientific evaluations, so it's not really based on science, and many of these are motivated. The U.S. FWS, or Fish and Wildlife Service, in 1999 did approve two approaches to protect species, the first of which is a safe harbor agreement. That's where landowners voluntarily take steps to restore, improve, maintain habitat for species. They get technical help. They really don't get any tax help or any money back from the government, but it's a good thing to do. There's something called the Voluntary Candidate Conservation Agreement, where landowners agree to conserve a declining population that's not listed. So maybe there's a species out there that we know is on the decline. It's not low enough to be threatened or endangered, but hey, let's precautionary principle there. The U.S. Endangered Species Act, of course, does have mixed reviews. A lot of people want to weaken it, repeal it, modify it, strengthen it, simplify it, maybe streamline it. So the good and the bad, a lot of big industry, of course, wants to get rid of it because they want to cut timber in regions that may have endangered species on it. Basically, if they find any endangered species, on any property. It's protected and you cannot destroy its habitat in the United States. There's also something that goes along with this called eminent domain, where the government can take your property if they find something of value like this on it. In 2005, the ESA budget was $58 million. Of course, our Department of Defense was about, just in comparison, our DOD, our Department of Defense, actually spends this in 1.5 hours in that regard. Accomplishments, of course, the species listed when in serious danger of extinction. It does unfortunately take decades for most species to become, or I should say fortunately, endangered or extinct, which is good. So we got to recognize them as soon as possible and try to get them on the list. More than half the species listed are actually stable or improving in the United States. So written story in the United States. Suggested changes to the ESA, of course, we always want to increase the budget, develop recovery plans more quickly. So if a species is on the endangered list, the gray wolf, of course, of northern Wisconsin is a success story too. So maybe use that as a model. We can, of course, establish wildlife refuges in other protected areas. The first wildlife refuge was on Pelican Island, I believe in New York, 1903. Theodore Roosevelt, remember he was the president of the Age of Environmentalism. Wildlife refuges are mainly wetland kind of sanctuaries, oftentimes there for breeding, habitat protected. Really need more of these for endangered plants especially. Maybe we have some abandoned military lands we could use for wildlife habitats. By the way, a lot of these are, even though they're protected refuges, a lot of times the military can override that if they see fit. Other things we can really look at are things like gene or seed banks. There's actually one of these up in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. And what it does is it preserves the genetic material of endangered plants. The one in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin actually hosts like corn and beans and potatoes and things like that of seeds, because what happens is if that ever gets wiped out, say we have like another potato famine like that in Ireland, what happens is we have potatoes stored and then we can regrow those. Well, let's do those with endangered species too. Botanical gardens, we've got one on the south side of Milwaukee. Living plants, let's keep them growing there, keep them alive. Maybe we can preserve endangered terrestrial species. We can do things like egg pulling. Egg pulling is done in regions where we like to go and relax, and of course maybe on a resort like in Florida. Instead of having people step on things like eggs of sea turtles, let's pull those and put them in protected areas or even mark them so people don't step on them. We can do captive breeding of these endangered species. That doesn't always work really well. That's like in a zoo, for example. We can do artificial insemination, embryo transfer, so from embryo transfer from one species really into another to help grow new ones and continue on a species. Use of incubators and cross-fostering. Cross-fostering oftentimes used in birds where one type of bird takes care of another objective. Zoos and aquariums, great, but limited space and funds. A lot of times these facilities are kind of almost like prisons for the organism. They're in a confined space. A success story is the California condor. It's the largest North American bird. It was nearly extinct. The birds were captured, and the ones that were out there and bred in captivity. Again, captivity is rough to try to get these creatures going. But what happened is by 2007, we released 135 back into the wild. The problem is they're still threatened by lead environment from lead shot or bullets. Reconciliation ecology, if you reconcile something, you make it better. The idea is to sustain wild species in the human-dominated portion of nature, maintain diverse yards. You can do stuff like this in your house. Put up a butterfly garden to get monarch butterflies coming back. Share responsibility for supporting biodiverse yards and gardens. A lot of times university and schools are leaders at this. Gardens. Of course, the idea of precautionary principle, better safe than sorry. Let's save some of these species before they go away. Let's preserve some of the species. Let's preserve some of their ecosystems, some of their niches before they go away, because they are of value. That is it for chapter 12.